In this unit, we're going to talk about DHCP, or Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol, and this is used to provide IP addresses to nodes on the network automatically. On any moderately sized network, we're not going to want to have to configure IP addresses and IP parameters manually on every single computer and server, so we need a protocol that can do that for us, and DHCP is the protocol that does that. So in this unit, we're going to describe the DHCP protocol and the process that DHCP uses. We're going to talk about how to install and configure a DHCP server. And then in a second slide deck, I'm going to talk about configuring DHCP server settings and talk to you a little bit about DHCP relay and how that works. So let's start with an overview of the DHCP protocol. So it's a component of TCP/IP protocol suite. It's used to assign IP addresses to a host automatically from a defined pool of addresses, which we talked about before. IP addresses are assigned via DHCP are usually leased. They're not permanently assigned, meaning you only have them for a finite period of time. And to prevent a disruption in communication, the client will typically try to renew the lease when the lease interval is 50% expired. So DHCP is based on broadcast packets because usually when you're a new computer on the network, you won't know who the DHCP server is. You won't even have an IP address yet as the source IP address. So there's really no way to to talk specifically to a certain computer. You don't have the information to do that yet. So we have to use broadcast to do that. So the request for an IP address between a DHCP client and a DHCP server is a 4-packet sequence. So first, the client sends a DHCP discover message to the DHCP server using UDP port 68. So it's a broadcast on UDP port 68. And it's also going to listen on port 67 for any responses that come back as a broadcast. So it's going to send a broadcast message out on port 68. And it's going to, and that's the DHCP discover, and it's going to bind to port 67, UDP port 67, waiting for a response. So once a DHCP server receives that message, that broadcast, it's going to send a DHCP offer, which basically is going to say, here's an IP address that I have for you, and it's going to send that through a broadcast again because we don't have an IP address yet, so we have to use a broadcast for that. So it's going to send a broadcast back to the a broadcast message that hopefully will be picked up by the client, and that's going to be the DHCP offer. And once that happens, the client's going to send DHCP requests saying, I got this IP address that you have for me. I would like to request that I can use this IP address. And if everything goes swimmingly, then you'll get a DHCP acknowledgement from the DHCP server. So you'll send the request, and then eventually you get back the acknowledgement saying you can go ahead and use that IP address. So from a high level, this is what it looks like. The client sends the discover message, the server sends back the offer, the client requests that IP from the offer, and then finally the DHCP server acknowledges that request. And again, all of this is happening with broadcast because there is no IP address yet on the client to communicate on directly, so it all has to be broadcast messages. So once the IP address is 50% in its lease period, right? So once it's at the point where it's 50% at the point where it's going to be expired, the client is going to send a unicast packet, right? Not a broadcast, because now it has an IP address and it knows the IP address for the DHCP server. So it sends a unicast packet to the server. A successful renewal is a 2-packet sequence. We send a request for the same IP that we already have, and then we get back the acknowledgement, just like before. So it's basically the last 2 messages of the 4-step process to get a new IP address. We don't need to do a discovery because we already knew who they are. We don't have to get an offer because we already have an IP. We're just going to say, this is the IP that I already have. Can I renew this, for the same period? And then you get back an acknowledgement, and you can continue using that IP address. In a normal network, this will happen over and over and over again. As long as the computer is turned on and hasn't had any interruption, it'll probably maintain the same IP address until something changes, which we'll talk about in just a moment. If the DHCP request fails, so if it doesn't get a response back, it will try typically 3 more times, at least in the Windows ecosystem. All right, so the renewal request may fail due to a couple different conditions. It could be that the server responds, but it can't honor the request. Maybe the address has been deleted. It's no longer in the scope, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes. It can't respond. Either it's not online or it's off. It's not. You can't reach it on the network or something like that. If that's the case, if it doesn't get any response at all, It's going to keep its current address until 87.5% of the lease interval has expired, and then it sends a new request. Again, so it'll send the request again, and there's two possible responses from the request. It could be that the DHCP server responds, or no DHCP server responds, and the client starts the process all over again from the beginning by sending the DHCP discover message that we talked about earlier. All right, so these are the different types of messages that we talked about. So as far as installing a DHCP server, DHCP server role can be installed in the Add Roles and Features wizard in the Server Manager, just like we've done with just about everything else. You can use the command shell to do this as well, the PowerShell rather, with a commandlet. So it's going to be install Windows feature DHCP, pretty straightforward. There's not a lot to configure here, but we'll talk about some configurations in the next slide deck. And after you install it, the DHCP console will be available in the Tools menu in Server Manager, and in a Windows domain, the DHCP server must be authorized. Basically, what that means is you can't have DHCP servers. But this is what the dialog is going to look like after you have it installed. In a Windows domain, you can't use DHCP unless it's authorized. The idea being that somebody can't just have a rogue DHCP server sitting on the network handing out IP addresses. So authorization is a pretty important feature in DHCP in a Windows network. It definitely gives us some better security for one thing, but also it can cause outages on the network. We've had people in some of the networks that I work in that, a good example is those little Wi-Fi hotspots. Somebody could come in with a Wi-Fi hotspot, or they can make their computer into a router in Windows, right, to share their internet connection, for example, and then they become a DHCP server. And if you happen to send a broadcast packet and you're in close proximity to that server, closer, it's fewer hops to that machine rather than the real DHCP server, then you're probably going to get a lease from that server and accept it rather than from the real DHCP server. And then you are either connecting to the network through some rogue DHCP server's router, or it's just simply not going to work, which would be a problem in itself. So a DHCP server authorization requires an enterprise administrator in the domain. And you can also do this from the PowerShell like anything else. So this is how you would add it as an authorized server in the PowerShell. All right, so we talked about server authorization, which we need before we can start using it in Active Directory. And in the next slide deck, I'm going to talk about DHCP scopes and all of the other configuration options in DHCP, and then I'll talk about DHCP relay in the last slide deck.